Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 109. And this episode, Matt and I wanted to talk about sort of how we define a genre, because most video game genres are defined by their gameplay experience, but as more and more games become narrative-driven or defined by the stories they tell, we can also define a genre by narrative, and sometimes those two don't exactly follow along the same path.
Yeah, it's something that we've been thinking about for a while, and if you're a longtime listener, you know we've done episodes about specific genres of gameplay, 2D platformers, 3D collectathons, Metroidvanias, and typically when we talk about those games, we are sticking strictly to the gameplay style, the mechanics of the game, but as the video game genre has broadened and there are more walking simulators and narrative games where the mechanics themselves are not like, when you say a walking sim, typically that means you're taking in story, interacting with stuff and not really doing anything, as it were, as far as heavy mechanics go. But that I don't think is enough of a descriptor anymore. I've played some games this year that I think really step outside what you expect of a genre, or even revisiting older games. I'm like, I'm thinking about this game differently than I did when I first played it. It doesn't fit this mold that I thought it did.
Absolutely. And especially because I would imagine as gaming, and I can only speak to gaming here as far as this goes, there is a definite amount of digging yourself into factions in a way. In much the same way that people have their console favorites, there's also those things of like, I don't play RPGs. I don't play sports games. I don't play puzzle games. So there's often been a kind of like very rigid line as to what defines those. And there is always that argument like, is this a real this or it's not a real this because of those? What genre is The Legend of Zelda? You're going to get a dozen different answers if you ask 8 different people. And that's just talking about how the gameplay goes. But design has shifted, and those definitions will change over time. And it's very funny, to go back to older games. I think a goofy version on this is, to go back to NES, SNES games, things of the 8-bit and 16-bit era and go, this is a bit Dark Souls-like. and actually mean it.
Yeah, sure.
And whether that is, and again, it's the Dark Souls of this is such a thing that gets, whether it actually gets thrown around as much as everyone thinks it does, it's mimetically an easy review for a gameplay experience. But what defines that? Is it its dark atmosphere? Is it the world building without hand holding? Or is it dodge rolling? Or is it the idea of you are going to be dashing yourself upon the rocks of this gameplay experience? You will be like building up skills of your characters, but you're building up the skill of yourself as you fail over and over again and get better every time and learn new strategies and everything else. Where you put it like that and you kind of go, well, that's a lot of genres. Exactly. How do we define these things?
Yeah, I mean, if you listen to our E3 special way back, you know that I'm excited about a brand new side-scrolling Metroidvania in the Metroid series, shockingly enough. Metroid Dread is coming out. And in the excitement for the lead up to Metroid Dread, I've replayed over the last few years all of the original Metroid games, except for the original release NES and Game Boy games, because I don't have access to them. And also, they are really effing hard.
They are.
So, but I did replay Zero Mission, which was a retelling of the original Metroid game on the Game Boy Advance. And I replayed Super Metroid a few years back on stream. And then I recently played for the first time the remake of Samus Returns, as well as I revisited my favorite Metroid game, Metroid Fusion. And something I noticed with Metroid Fusion that I never noticed before is that it is absolutely a horror game. It is telling a suspenseful and fearful story. And for those who are not familiar with Metroid Fusion, in the story of Metroid Fusion, Samus gets infected with the X parasite, a thing that almost kills her and bonds to her body and her armor, leaving her in this weakened state. But because of that, they cure her with Metroid cells, and she is able to live and even absorb the X parasite. But what you find out very early in the game is that a version of the X parasite has evolved into what they're calling SAX. It has all of Samus's original abilities, armor, look, but it's this kind of like zombie-ish version of Samus just wandering through this space station, destroying shit. And the first time you see her, like, you're above her and she's in a path below and she can't see you, but like she stomps in really slowly. The music cuts out. They do a zoom in on her face, and it's like this version of Samus's face with like white eyes. It very much is playing up to horror tropes. And even bosses later in the game look disfigured and deformed as the X-Parasite infects these different things or creatures. And there was always a sense of fear in the Metroid series, even from the original, from the music to the environments. But I feel like Fusion really leaned into that. And what we've seen of Dread is you're being chased by these robots. You don't know why they're hunting you. You can't fight them. They seem invulnerable. So that game also is going to be adding onto that fear factor of it. And I just don't know that I ever perceived these games that way until I revisited my favorite of them. And I think it's because we are being taught to look at things more diversely than we did when we first played these games. They were very much tightly tied to their gameplay and not much else. Whereas now, because narrative has become an even bigger focus as time has went on, we are reevaluating what we see in these games and what we take from them, both story, mechanics, and beyond.
I do love the fact that as much story and background as you gave to Metroid Fusion, until you talked about the SAX, all of that is in the first 5 minutes of the game.
Yeah.
And I just want to point that out for people who've never played this game. There's a lot in there. And it might be my favorite Metroid as well as the fact that the idea of going, it's a side-scrolling game, but it's also a horror story or a horror game feels very incongruous to the whole idea. And the horror, I suppose, that Metroid has elicited or evoked ever since the NES days is a very different kind of horror to what you think of when you think of horror games. Speaking only for myself, but you hear like, oh, it's a horror game. Is it Left 4 Dead? Are we fighting zombies or vampires, or what strange monsters of the night are we fighting? Whereas Metroid is very much about that in space, nothing can hear you scream kind of existential horror. The nothing is scarier, empty room psychology kind of horror. And we never saw it that way. It's just like, oh, it's a sparse platform game. Even though you wouldn't call Metroid horror games, you'd call them Metroidvanias. God damn it, we coined a term to describe it. And yet, most Metroidvania games aren't necessarily horror stories or thought of as horror games, but the stories they tell do evoke that still. I mean, I understand that Resident Evil was defined by being called survival horror. And it's an interesting thing that, yeah, what the SAX in Metroid Fusion, because the X-Parasite lives by aping and mimicking the things that it consumes or the things that it attacks. It attacked Samus at a point when she was in classic Metroid style at the beginning of the game with all of her gear, all of her stuff, every weapon, everything. And after Samus is weakened and left in a state where she has to rebuild herself even more deeply than in previous Metroid titles, to have the SAX walking around with Samus's full armament, there is a palpable sense of dread that the scene that you elegantly described, Matt, is one that evokes horror on its own, but you get that distinct dropping feeling of, I know how strong Samus can be. I can't compete with this thing. You see it throughout the game, and you can't fight it. Sometimes it doesn't let you fight it. The scene where you first see the SAX and the side-scroller, you're in the vents.
Yeah.
Great intergalactic bounty hunter Samus Aran is crawling through the vents for safety.
Yeah.
Again, it still continues that nothing is scarier existential dread while also giving you a strange monster. And yeah, the Metroid series was never much to go for the H.R. Geiger style of body horror with their monsters or anything, but there's still all sorts of like unsettling things, all sorts of scary things, all sorts of those points of, yeah, you know, you're the little guy against the big thing. And yeah, Metroid Dread seems to be continuing that and building on that. And I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, totally. No, I am as well. A member of the Shrimp POV family, the incredible Alex Lavelle, has constantly been talking with us about the Metroid games as we're all revisiting them with the excitement for Dread. So I think sometime later this year, we will probably do a Metroid retrospective. We try not to do a ton of franchise retrospectives, but I feel like Metroid is a good one since it is getting a resurgence. We are, in theory, someday getting Metroid Prime 4, which is a whole other story. But I think this is a good pivot point to talk about horror because, so you mentioned Resident Evil being a survival horror franchise and probably one of the kings of survival horror. There's Silent Hill and a few others. But, even Resident Evil itself went through a shift that it had to return back to. We talk about the genre of gameplay and the genre of storytelling. Resident Evil is a survival horror game. Low ammo, not a lot of options, puzzle solving, escaping to try and save your life is the pillars of that game. And that franchise until the fourth game. My favorite game in the franchise because it was a little less scary. Resident Evil 4 is an action game. There are still horror moments and it is still scary at times, but they give you more ammo, they give you more resources. It is designed to let you combat the evil instead of trying to run or escape from it. And they did that for a few games. 5 and 6, I believe, were both also much like that. And then Resident Evil 7 came out. Now, first-person perspective, a different character. You're playing as Ethan. You're stuck in a house with these horrifyingly, barely recognizable humans, and you're trying to save your wife. And then, more recently, Resident Evil Village, Resident Evil 8, all horniness aside, is also very disturbing and scary, but does lean into action moments. It kind of blends the two. And I think it's really interesting to watch the scope of Resident Evil and how they're like, all right, we're going to be based in this genre, but then we're going to shift to what suits the story and bring the players along for the ride and make those decisions. And now after Resident Evil 8, I have no idea where this franchise will go because they've kind of just dove in and out of these different genres that they've toyed with.
Yeah. Well, and I think this kind of comes to one of my favorite things about video games and why I'm always happy to talk about them. The fact that games are unique in how you interact with the story as far as media is concerned. A Resident Evil movie is always going to be that Resident Evil movie. You hit play, you watch it. Maybe you can rewind it and go back to your favorite parts. Maybe you can change the audio or put up different subtitles, but there's not really a thing of it goes in a completely different direction because of choices you made while watching the movie, unless, I don't know, yes, there's corner cases on that, but I think it mostly has to do with closing your eyes and watching different scenes out of order or something. But the thing is, there is game genre and narrative genre. And I'm sure there's others in between that and amongst that, but those are the two pillars we're talking about here. And you can continue the narrative idea of a horror game or a fantasy game, a romance game, and changing how you experience it, how you interact with it is also a twist on things. Resident Evil is still about, at the end of the day, God damn it, Umbrella Corporation. God damn it. In whatever form. It's just God damn it, Umbrella. For fuck's sake. But how you interact with that. Or there are games that you interact with them in a very classic kind of way. And that allows everyone to change how the story is told. Whether through dialogue boxes or simply through how the gameplay changes. I am thinking of an indie platformer called Eversion, which, Matt, have you played that one?
I have not.
Eversion is a strange game, and I love it. Eversion is, and spoilers for anyone who hasn't played this game, this is one of those, everybody knows the twist of whatever movie. Most folks who have played Eversion or talk about it know the twist. Here's the thing. It starts off as an adorably cutesy platformer. You're a weird little fluff ball looking thing with eyeballs, and there's flowers and gorgeous music, and it feels like any sort of I'm trying to remember what color it is. I think he's orange. I'm just doing this off of memory. It's been a few years since I played it, and memory makes fools of us all. But you are playing what feels like any sort of I don't know, Adventure Island kind of thing, 8-bit, 16-bit, just a goofing around thing. And there is a button that lets you evert. And what that means is you can reach certain points in the game or certain spots in these And it's even like Mario style in like 1-1, 1-2, 1-3, like kind of levels. And if I remember correctly, but you get the little points and you hit the evert button and you shift into a slightly different world. And there's 8 levels of eversion. You slowly work your way through them and it changes how you can interact with the world. Like, oh, there isn't a platform in this version. Let me evert down a little. Oh, there's the platform. But now the blocks that are smiling aren't smiling anymore. They have like just sort of humdrum faces. And the deeper you evert, the more goddamn terrifying this game becomes. Ending in like blood red sky, gigantic silhouetted skeletal hands coming out of every pit you jump over attempting to grab you. Body horror, just all kinds of crazy things. And it starts off it's just a very like boop, 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 jump around platformer, and there's nothing in it to suggest that it would be anything else from the gameplay experience. And again, there's no conversations that go on in this game, but because of how you expect one of the genres to go, you don't expect the other genre. And that is a fun way that games can subvert expectations, but even from one franchise to the next or single entry to the next, but within a franchise, yeah, Resident Evil could make us be running for our lives with not enough ammo. I also want to point out, and I'm not the first person who thought this, the idea that survival horror, I don't have enough resources, end of the game, here's a rocket launcher. We have wildly different ideas about not enough weaponry. But
yes.
But yeah, like Resident Evil 3 was definitely a pinnacle of the original games of that, like being chased by the SAX in Metroid Fusion, Nemesis chasing after you and finding yourself in tight spaces and the door opens, stars, and you're screwed.
Yeah.
And then Resident Evil 4 to be like, we're still fighting, well, we're not fighting zombies. Not quite, but we are still dealing with the Umbrella Corporation. And here's a lot of guns. The narrative genre is still more or less the same. But yeah, you're right, the game genre shifts, and because it's still a Resident Evil game, this becomes a fun thing of like, what makes a Resident Evil game a Resident Evil game? Is it the story? Is it the gameplay? Is it a certain je ne sais quoi feeling of the experience? And this is why we argue about it.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, Resident Evil game is going to be whatever Capcom decides is a Resident Evil game. But for the fans, it could be a different story. And it's funny you bring up Eversion because I feel like in recent years, indie games have been exploring this kind of finding tropes and totally throwing curveballs a lot. I mean, I believe we've mentioned it on the show before, but Geoff and I, as well as other folks at Certain POV, are a fan of a game called Doki Doki Literature Club. If you don't know what Doki Doki Literature Club is, good. Never find out and play the game. It's still free on Steam, I believe. There might be a more paid expanded version as well.
Yes.
I know there's a console version coming too, but this is a game that takes a visual novel and plays with expectations of it and turns it on its head. And even in a similar way, I mean, not all games have one genre either, especially when it comes to the narrative. My favorite example, of course, that I will always go back to is Undertale. Undertale is, I'd say, mostly a comedic, tongue-in-cheek, playing with expectations of the typical turn-based RPG. However, on the second or subsequent playthroughs after, when you can explore Alphonse's lab, that is a horror game the entire time. Also, if you decide to do a genocide run and kill every monster in the underground, that also very much becomes a horror game, equipped with a jump scare later in the game as well. And like, that's something that no JRPGs that I'm familiar with have really done since Earthbound. Earthbound had elements of that. I've never played Earthbound, but I know the famous scenes where like you die and you leave your bodies and possess robots to go into the far-flung future, I think. It's just really interesting when games kind of mix it up within the game itself, because that is also less common. And I think is something that I love when games do, because then you can't put a defined pin on it. Like if I had to give a story-based genre description for Undertale, I don't know that I could. It's harder to pin that down because they move in between these worlds in a way that I think is quite clever, that not a lot of AAA games do, but tons of indie games do.
Yeah, and especially because there are so many games, even before, like, I guess the indie explosion, if we want to, I don't know if there's even a period to be called that, but it feels like there is. Even before that, there was so much of there's so many games that come out, and like none of us can play all of them. And, well, what kind of game is it? What do I play? I need to read reviews of this game. Put a number on it. Give me a less than 3-word phrase that defines what the game is. All of these things. And this does a disservice to the games themselves and a disservice to all of us. But I don't want to call it a necessary evil because I'm not sure that it is, but it's currently what we're working with and what we're working through. A lot of larger gaming publications and games journalists are eschewing using number reviews. What you often get, and we were getting this for a while, even with an 8.8 at the end of the review, was sort of a TLDR, a bolded paragraph at the bottom that's just kind of okay, here is my bottom line about the game. I've spilled a bunch of ink above this, but if you just need like a quick, you see a game in a GameStop and you're on your phone, like, what should I think about this game? Okay, that, cool. But that still it's such a rough thing, and I love how messy genres are getting.
Yeah.
I love it. I've been very open about the fact that some of my favorite games are ones that raise questions about the nature of player versus game and interactivity therein and the sorts of stories that we think we're telling when we engage in the game. And you're not going to read a novel and there's suddenly like, it's not a choose your own adventure book where you turn to a spot and it suddenly becomes a different kind of story. But you can, through the nature of video games, depending on the title, Undertale is, depending on how you interact with the game, the genre can shift a little bit. There could be more comedy, there could be less comedy. The comedy could be quite bitter. And there are other larger games that there's a lot to be said about different open world games, but you can have moments, you can have quests, you can have options that kind of rarely do you get like a complete swerve. But, oh, you want to play it a little more like this? Well, we can oblige as well. And I don't know how many games really lean into that or do that in a way of you choose the genre based on how you play this game. That's a complicated thing to do, and that's a lot to plan for and write for. But I'm sure that there are kind of binary genre shifts that can happen within games, and I'm sure those have happened, and I'm just not thinking of them right now.
Well, I think also something that's really important to talk about is this idea that... So I've talked about this a lot with Mass Effect. There's a mission in the first Mass Effect game on Luna, which is the Earth's moon, where there's a rogue VI that's killed all the scientists and you need to like purge it from the system. The mission has almost no music other than some ambient noises. Your squad mates don't have a lot of dialogue, and there are no humans. You fight these cold rocket launchers and turrets and automated weapons until you clear it out. And that VI that evolved into an AI that you expel from this Luna base comes back later in the games and becomes a very important part of the games towards the end. But this mission is absolutely a horror mission within Mass Effect. But that's because of the player more than the game. It does have the elements because I am a skittish person who is easily scared. I am unnerved by this mission. I know plenty of people who just go through these missions gun blazing. They don't care, whatever. I'm going to blow up these robots and move on. I think games have a strength in that. There are even moments in the second Mass Effect when you're fighting the collectors, when you're on their ship and nothing's happening and you're not hearing anything and you're just exploring. You're like, okay, when's the other shoe going to drop? I mean, also for the same thing with Mass Effect, some people consider it a social sim game. I know folks who have no interest in the gunplay, which makes sense to a degree.
Yeah.
But they want to romance Garrus. They want to build friendships with Jacob. Like, they want to explore the social hierarchy of these games, and they're less interested in the combat side. But no one would ever call Mass Effect a visual novel, but you can absolutely play it looking at it that way and focusing on the relationships and the conversations and less on the gameplay, since the gameplay does move the narrative forward, but you can get a ton of story just from enjoying the narrative stuff. There's no way to completely remove that, but there is a story mode version of the games, especially in 2 and 3, where the focus is on the story and the combat isn't as difficult. It's kind of toned down, so you can just get through it.
Yeah, there's entire missions that can be solved through social aspects rather than gunplay.
Correct. And I just always think that kind of swerve is really interesting as well. And that's also based on player determination as much as I think that when BioWare was creating Mass Effect, they wanted an in-depth narrative with incredibly detailed story choices. But back then, visual novels weren't as common. They existed, but they weren't as well known as they are now. I don't think BioWare was like, I want to make a visual novel hybrid with a third-person shooter. It seems to have worked out that way, but I don't know that that was the intent. And I think also genres tend to pigeonhole us. I think that if anyone who's been listening for a while remembers, in January of 2020, I was like, this is the year I'm going to play more first-person shooters and see if I like them. And what I learned pretty early in the year after playing a few and then looking back on previous games I've played, I was like, oh, I like shooters. I just don't like military shooters. I don't like the Call of Duty games. But like, I've been playing Doom since I was a kid. I love the Halo series. I enjoyed Gears of War, which I know is third-person shooter, not first-person. But like, I went on this quest to prove something to myself that I then realized, oh, I do like these games. It just depends on the story being told for me to really engage. In the same way with racing games, I spent a lot of years saying I don't like racing games, but I played Mario Kart. I love the old Need for Speed. And then I discovered Forza Horizon 4 and fell in love with it. It was an open world car action game where you would do races, but you'd also do missions and stunts and other things. And like seeing the trailer for Horizon 5, which is coming out later this year, I was excited about that in a way I hadn't been for a while, because I was like, oh, I do like these games. I just need the right fit. I think I'm at a place now as a person who plays games where I don't look at a genre of game and go, I have no interest in that and I hate that, because I think you're selling yourself short. Now, again, the military shooters, maybe I haven't found the right one yet, right? I've heard the Battlefield games are really good. I've yet to play them. But like, I think ultimately, because of how nebulous these kinds of genre mixes can be now, to just whole hog right off, I hate this type of gameplay, I think is less valid now for me personally, because you never know what's going to pull you into game, what you're going to like, what you're going to love until you try it. And thankfully, we're in a position with things like Game Pass and other things where you can get access to a lot of games for not a lot of money and try things out, see what you like, see what you don't. Also, a lot of games with demos that then roll over into the main game, things like that. A lot of RPGs are doing that recently. Like, I think it's much easier to get access to that. And that's why I'm not so quick to just look at a game and go, oh, it's this kind of game? Well, I'm not going to bother because I don't like that kind of game. Because the reality is, I think because of how creative creators are getting, we don't know what we don't like. You know, you have an assumption to some degree. Like I always said, I hated horror movies. And then Jordan Peele proved me wrong, because his last two horror movies were phenomenal and I loved from start to finish. And I'm excited for his next one. Like, it's okay to have preferences, of course, but I think you have to be a little more open-minded. If something piques your interest, don't just write it off because of what genre it lives in, either gameplay or story-wise.
Right. And the tricky thing is in finding new games is figuring out, because yes, we try to, as humans, streamline our decision-making process. And having these bits of shorthand is very handy. It is, which is why we do it. It's not like, oh, well, this is stupid, so we're all just going to bang our heads against it. But it's not perfect, but it does also allow us, to start to go like, all right, you do enjoy shooters more, and you realize the shooters that you do enjoy, but it's probably the kind of thing of like, okay, here's another shooter game. Okay, what's going to draw me in on this? I'm not here just for that. For some of us, for all of us that play games, there are certain genres where it's almost like, I don't care about anything else. I do, but tell me it's this. And I'm there. You already have my money.
Yeah.
For some people, that's a franchise. For some people, that's a genre of gameplay or a genre of story, a setting, a creator, whatever it is. How many people bought Death Stranding because they were interested in the story, and how many bought it because Hideo Kojima?
Right.
There are those aspects and those things. And to go back to something you were saying before, the idea of games can have singular missions or small ideas where the genre shifts. They can get away with that, certainly in longer form games, because we don't know how long everyone is going to be playing every part of the game. There are wonderful websites out there, howlongtobeat.com, if you've never been there. If you want to know how long it will, on average, take you to beat a game, look it up. And it kind of tells you how long to beat the main story, to do a few extras, or to 100% complete the game. And that's based on times that people submit. So it may take you, if a game says it's 20 hours, it may take you 10, it may take you 50. And a lot of games that allow you to sort of unfurl the story by talking to NPCs, by reading notes and things that you pick up. By discovering the narrative, you can find the things that you link up with or whatever. If you're somebody who likes to talk to every NPC, which I'm guilty of, a mission that really the gameplay loop is 20 minutes, you could spend 2 hours on it. And that same sort of thing can grow or shrink. And so to be able to have a singular piece of a greater whole that you may or may not ever interact with, depending upon how the game is designed, but to then get into it, or even that sort of thing where we rarely stop watching a movie in the middle and then come back to it. We do this with books, you know.
Yeah.
It's been a long time since I've had the time and attention span to sit and devour an entire fantasy novel doorstopper in a day. But being able to close off on a chapter and come back to it later, it lives in our head a little longer and we come back to it. If we start off on a mission where it's a nice fantasy RPG that suddenly turns kind of dark and horrifying, and we save like towards the beginning of it, or we die on it like 5, 10, 50 times, we're going to be spending a lot more time with it. And by the nature of interactivity, investing a lot more of our emotions and our long-term memory towards it. And so even small moments like that can become a larger piece of that greater narrative. And I'm just absolutely delighted and fascinated by when games can pull that off and you get an out-of-genre experience, I suppose, in the midst of a larger game. And those are usually, yes, more open-world games, more big games like that. And sometimes it comes around the other side. Mass Effect, yeah, I don't think they set out to make a visual novel, but the thing is, you don't have to submit your games for genre approval.
Right.
There's no council on that. And look, everyone argues about what makes an RPG an RPG. It's a role-playing game. If you're playing a role, it's an RPG kind of thing. So anytime you're a named character, you're playing a role, RPG, done. But no. So this gets fun. And you can create a game and never think of visual novels.
Yeah.
But you kind of make a visual novel a little bit. And I think that's sort of why there's always genre de jours that get sprinkled onto every game. Are they all roguelikes for a while? I guess they're all procedurally generated. That's what we're dealing with for the next 5 years. But a lot of what I've noticed of the past few years is visual novel getting tacked onto the end of it. And I think because having that little extra bit of interactivity or the ability to sort of shift what kind of narrative you're telling based on the stories you tell. And that can get a little nebulous because, again, people data mine. People, as soon as a game comes out, they pull every piece out of it as best they can. And you find hidden endings or you find weird things that suddenly take horrifying turns. And people get upset about them sometimes because, well, that just goes against these things. No, but if you make choices that lead towards that, character development happens. And not all development is good. And that's like reading a choose your own adventure book, page 1 to end page throughout. And I don't have a final point on anything I'm saying here. I'm just thinking of, I was remembering people getting upset about the data mined ending to Dream Daddy.
Oh, yeah.
And that becoming a whole thing. And it's just, you could play the game hundreds of times and never see it.
Yeah.
Based on how you choose to interact with the narrative and with the gameplay loop, you are going to get a different sort of gameplay experience.
Yeah, I mean, and also I think what's really important to point out is that some of the games don't just toy with genre of storytelling, but like Geoff is saying, also toy with genre of gameplay or shift between gameplays. Some of those games are more popular than others, like No More Heroes famously is a third-person kind of action beam katana game. But you do a ton of mini games that are get this thing, gather that thing, find this thing. And then even in the second game, you have like these mini moments that are different genres. And I think that comes from Suda51, first of all, being a mad scientist level genius, but also it comes from wanting to toy with, like, No More Heroes was a very meta game, toying with the idea of the gamer frat boy and leaning into how ridiculous it was and how stupid it was and how over the top. Like, Travis Touchdown is not someone to be admired. He's someone to look at and go, oh, okay, I see. But like, it's still a fun character to live with and to work with and move through. But that wasn't enough for Suda to mess with, and also worked with other things. And like there was an arcade, a smaller game that came out between the second and third that was like a top-down action game that was multiplayer. Like Suda 51 is not content to just play in one space. He wants to play in all of them. And we don't see as many games doing that, but more games are doing that now than ever before. And I think it's what is realistic within the narrative and also the suspension of disbelief. If a game is just changing genre every mission, if there's not something justifying that on some level, that could get boring or overwhelming or whatever. But like, think about all the games that have like Skyrim, for example, which we've all played at this point because it's been on everything, I think, even toasters.
Yeah, it's subliminal now. If you haven't chosen to play it, you've played it in your dreams.
Yeah, it's just happened in your dreams. But like, building armor, cooking, all of the stuff for mini games within it. You can, even in the later games, I think it was called Hearth something. You could build your own house with the DLC, like, and you could do interior design. I think it is not strange for a game these days to have these smaller things within the game that allow you to try and do different things. And I think as games evolve and grow, we're just going to see more of that. I mean, think about our favorite game ever, Shovel Knight, and how over the years and the expansions and the additional campaigns, they've added more and more stuff. King of Cards has a whole card battle mini game that you could literally just play that card game. You could never finish the main story and just play matches in the card game, earn new cards, unlock new cards. There's tons of rare cards that you can find. Final Fantasy has done that for years with several card games, the arcade games in Final Fantasy VII, like the bike riding and the snowboarding. I think games want to toy with this stuff because they also want to provide different experiences, so people could be like, well, I'm tired of grinding battles over and over again to get Cloud to level 99. Let me go do the snowboarding game to like blow off some steam, but I can still play this game that I love.
Yeah, because you have to manage in long form games where you want to count the average game time in tens of hours. If it's the same thing over and over all of the time, that can get a little tedious. It can get boring. And if you have a game that has a robust grouping of subsystems, you can play games and never do crafting or never interact with this one mini game except for when that one time you have to because they want to introduce it to you or whatever else. But you can choose to engage in that and go ham on it. Because these are beats and acts and arcs that you don't have to plan for in shorter form narratives. One thing I do enjoy about the just sheer amount of digital distribution avenues for games right now is games can be charged for as much as they need to be. You don't have to charge $40 to $60 for a game that may only take you 2 hours, even if it's an amazing 2 hours. It's like, we want you to enjoy this, and to make it easy for you to get it, it's $5. Get it, enjoy it. Like, everyone feels like they got a great experience there. And those can be much more tight and focused. And I am all for very tight and focused gameplay and where narrative and gameplay and everything works together. Even if they're not the same genre, you can tell a story without any words based on how the game is played. Like Journey.
Yeah.
A game where much is said and much is done, but you never really... There's no dialogue. You don't talk to anybody. Nothing. But what a story. What an experience. And I got that one as part of PS Plus, so I paid nothing for it and I feel great about it. But longer games, yeah, you have to kind of break it up. Even if you saved the game and walked away, you're not going to play a 60-hour RPG all in one sitting, I hope. Certainly not for your first time. But having, something like Gold Saucer where you can play those mini games, having whatever card game that it is, being able to just do some little things. And it's also funny how we then link those gameplay experiences to what we think about the game. I'm going to bring up the story I was telling you before we started recording, Matt, how as of recording this, my wife and I finally finished playing Persona 5 Royal.
It's taken 17 years. No, I'm kidding.
It actually took 169 hours.
Jesus.
Nice. Yeah. Again, at least 20 of those hours were times where Sarah saved the game and walked away to do something and we got distracted somewhere else. It's like, should we turn the game off? I think we should turn the game off kind of thing. But, so we probably still put easily over 120 hours, probably closer to 150 into the game. And yeah, that's a game where there is dungeon crawling, a great RPG battle system, a beautifully integrated crafting system that Sarah doesn't like Pokemon games because she likes being able to have a party and that's it. But like, I'm sorry, I have to catch all of them and I need to level them up and no, that's ridiculous. But the personas, being able to like fuse them to make new ones, like we 100% of the compendium because we could and because it was awesome. And all of the social aspects and conversations that go on between the dungeon crawling is just as important, and they all feed and fuel each other, and I really like that. And there's other little mini games that would go on in it, and it's kind of all right, we're going to the batting cages. Why? Because I need to get the high score. I need to do a perfect run on this kind of thing, and it's fun. But after playing it, Sarah and I had a conversation of, all right, what's the next game we're going to play together? Because we both have games that we play on our own, but it's like, hey, we both have time, let's hang out and play this game.
Yeah.
Persona 5 was that. A lot of Final Fantasies are that. So we typically do larger RPGs, and those are great. And Sarah was like, I don't want to like immediately dive into something like Persona 5 again. I loved the game, but let's take a break. Which also means we'll wait a little while before we play Strikers.
Right.
But we're going to. And so for me, that meant, okay, so let's not jump into an RPG right now. And we were trying to figure stuff out. And nothing was quite gelling. And I said something like, all right, so no RPGs. Cool. And she later went, I think we're misunderstanding each other. I was thinking more in terms of, like, Final Fantasy is very different to me than Persona 5. It's not the mechanics that matter to her. Or they are, but not the mechanics, I think. Because there's very robust systems going on. And so we started playing a game that is more of a cool, funny, bit of a point and click game, but like a cool story game called Later Alligator that we're very excited to get back to later. Alligator. But from the first few minutes of the game where it was kind of I'm choosing who to talk to, I'm asking them questions, I'm picking up clues. Okay, this is the part of the Persona 5 experience that we need to take a break from. It's fun, it's cool, and it's great discovering all that about everybody, but this is the break. Let's play something else entirely. We are back to playing our way through Spyro Reignited, which is either story or gameplay experience very different. And so it's a funny thing where what are the commonalities of a genre or of a narrative? It's the same sort of thing of the experience of, what's this movie about? You'll love it. It has gay people in it, which is a very queer experience. It's like, okay, what happens to them?
Yeah.
Oh, it's great. But what? And so it's funny to find those sort of, okay, where's the overlap? Do I like being able to talk to people regardless of genre? Okay, cool. Metal Gear Solid is one of my favorite series. I don't play a ton of stealth games, but I do love what I have termed military opera as far as a narrative goes. And it's wonderful and it's ridiculous and it gives me just the right amount of delving into things and making like Pepe Sylvia style marker boards of connecting things. And really, I do enjoy the gameplay. I do. It's great and I love it. But yeah, all of these different things, I'm just pulling at threads here because we don't have a conclusion. We're exploring.
Yeah, I notoriously hated stealth games, and then they put Batman in a stealth game, and I was like, oh no, I love stealth games because the Arkham series is phenomenal, and I like being stealthy in them. But again, I don't like Metal Gear Solid. I'm not really a fan of Hideo Kojima, and I never really liked the Metal Gear games because of that gameplay. So it's really interesting to see that divergence. And then, like, not all of these divergences are based just on the gameplay genre or the story genre quite specifically. I mean, one franchise that I've become obsessed with over the last few years and have fallen deep in love with is the Yakuza franchise. And the Yakuza franchise on its surface is very much a compelling crime drama, more or less. You know, you're playing through a lot of the games as Kiryu Kazuma and a few other characters who then recur as well. And it's usually the main story revolving around Kiryu and anyone associated with Kiryu are very deep, dramatic honor and family. Sorry, I had to do the Vin Diesel thing. And very serious. But then all the side quests and the side stories and sub stories tend to be very comedic and goofy. And then there are mini games in this game where, like, you sing karaoke, you photograph young women who are models, all of these different weird things. But there's no note of it in the main story. And it doesn't feel like a break in it either. It feels like both these worlds can exist. And also there are over-the-top characters like Majima Goro, who was voiced by Mark Hamill in the original PlayStation games, but it's all, I mean, you can have an English cast, but I use the Japanese actors because I've gotten so used to them and love those actors. But like, he is over the top, very Joker-esque, very always excited to see Kiryu, causing trouble. Sometimes they're enemies, sometimes they're friends. And that still exists within the main narrative. And whenever this character does a wildly wacky and cartoonish things, people just accept it at face value. There's no comment on it. There's no, why is he doing that? It's so weird. It's, this is this character. This is who he is. He's a living cartoon. This is the life we lead. And I love that.
We contain multitudes.
Yeah. And I like that Yakuza can exist and have all of these different multitudes, but people still enjoy the games. And that's kind of what they're known for. And like, I haven't played Judgment, which is a spin-off franchise that is getting a new installment, but I've heard good things about that as well. They also had like a Resident Evil style, like survival horror spinoff called Dead Souls, which I've never played, which was on PS2. Like, I love a versatility of a franchise where I can go and have a good time, and that's the focus, and that I'm there for both. I love the deep, serious, important narrative, but I also love the goofy stuff. And like, I don't play a ton of the mini games in the Yakuza franchise. I do some of the sub stories, but not all of them. That's also because I'm trying to make a mad dash for Yakuza 7, Yakuza Like a Dragon, because I made this promise myself I'd play the whole franchise and then play the new game. And I'm almost there. I'm like a third of the way through 5.
Damn.
Yeah. And it's been such a great ride. And I love all these characters, but I think the diversity of the storytelling is why I like it. I did go into Yakuza 0 assuming, okay, it's a crime drama. I've heard good things. The characters are really pretty. Let's play this game and see. And then I fell in love with it because it was more than I expected. And I think when genre and gameplay are working at their best, as well as the minutia of a game in all levels, when those are all working in tandem at their best is when I am the most happy. It's why I love the Mass Effects and the Dragon Ages and the Yakuzas and the Metroids and everything else, is because it's not a complex story that will pull me in. It's a interesting and unique story that has elements beyond its expectation. And I think that's something that's harder to just kind of find, but when you do and you know it's right, you can't deny how right it feels.
Yeah, absolutely. And it definitely is. There's all of these indefinable elements of what appeals to us in a game, where one game we are all about its attitude and its world. Another one, that's not what we care about at all. Yeah, the Yakuza franchise is one that is very much, hey, play in this world. And having, if you want it to be serious, play the main game and it's serious. But also any of these side missions, it's almost a bit more over the top because it's like, hey, come here. Want to go slot car racing? Check it out. Come on. Kind of thing. And you can engage with as much or as little of that as you want. And that's so cool. Also, I do want to comment. You mentioned the fact that Batman got you to like some stealth games. My Sarah is not a huge Metal Gear Solid fan. This is definitely one of those. She's like, I love that you love it. Cool. But she loves the Batman games. She loves stealthing around. She loves being Batman. All of it. And she's a huge Batman fan. Yeah. Like, she's a bigger Batman fan than I am, and I do love Batman. And so I'd wanted to share the Persona series with her because I loved 3 and I'm excited to play more, and I knew I wanted to play 5. And so it was kind of a thing of like, okay, what I know about the game are these things, and some of it was like, there's stealth to it, but not like punishing stealth. It's an RPG where you can sneak around and you're a phantom thief and you enter into people's minds and steal that, like, you do these things. And then the Persona 5 Royal version that we have, you have a grappling hook. Like, there are all these weird little trappings that it was kind of okay, yeah, let's start the game. Let's see how we feel about this. The opening is stylish as hell. It's like, all right, yeah, okay, cool. This got me in the door. And it's always so tricky after playing a game for over 100 hours. You're like, do I have to get to know new people? Oh, God. But you do. And now that you are so deep into the Yakuza series, there are so many characters there now that you're like, they're old friends. Yep. Even if you're playing a completely different genre of game, you are still getting these weird little familiar experiences. And that's where game design can have fun with expectations. You know, at the very beginning of this episode, we talked a lot about horror games, and you expect those to play a certain way. You go, this is a platformer. That can't be horror. Or that can tell a story about family, or that can't whatever, but it can. And you can have very arcadey experiences that are just first-person shooters or quick stories, whatever that is. But we do have our shorthand for what a gameplay experience feels like and should be. And that allows us to continually be surprised. And not necessarily in a gotcha, no spoilers way, but continue to engage with our favorite characters and go back to our favorite worlds, follow our favorite creators, or follow along our favorite purported genre lines to find new twists on things. There are those games that are under one genre that we love, and we go, oh, one could also interpret this like a puzzle game, like a racing game, one of the reasons I like the old Metal Gear Solid games a lot is they really are kind of puzzle games at the end of the day.
Right.
For me. When you have the little radar thing up at the top, you could have a stealth game that is just that radar, but there's more to it. And so you find those pieces, whether the style, the genre, the thing that you connect to, and that leads to the next one. And I love that.
Yeah, I think for me, very recently, I've noticed that some games, I don't even need to have played them or seen a ton of gameplay to be interested. Mm-hmm. A game that I started playing as of when we're recording, I'll probably be done by the time this airs, is a game that I saw ads for earlier in the year, and then it fell out of my brain until it came out and a friend of mine was reviewing it. But it's a game called Death's Door. And for those who don't know, Death's Door is an indie game where it's kind of top-downish action. Think Hades, but it's not a roguelike, but it has that kind of look as far as where your character's on screen. But it has this Tim Burton-y, Miyazaki-ish kind of look, and you are a crow with a giant sword, and you are a reaper, and you go to these places and you reap souls. And it's got a very tongue-in-cheek kind of Tim Burton-y morbid humor to it. And I've fallen in love with it. It's great. I'm only a couple of hours in, but I'm having fun. But looking at it, the gameplay very much read to me like Hades. It was going to be kind of a roguelike, maybe a Dark Souls style, like hard to beat game. And it's not. It's challenging, but it is that kind of action game without the kind of punishing difficulty that I was expecting. And that has been a relief because I really love the aesthetic of the game in a way that I wanted to play this regardless of what it played like, in a similar way to why I played Hades. I'm not good at roguelikes or roguelites, either of them. But I wanted to play Hades so bad and liked the aesthetic of it so bad and love, of course, the developer who made it, that I was like, all right, I'm just going to play it. And I ended up falling in love with it, and it had accessibility options that made it easier for me to play. And I think looking at a game and what it gives you can be enough to take you to where you want to go with it. And I think at the end of the day, for this conversation, we're not saying that one way to judge games is better than the other. Ideally, there is no right way to judge games. We've talked about this with journalists before. You find a reviewer that you like and you read their reviews. If there's this person in games journalism who you like their writing style, you like their takes, you will go to them because you can trust their thoughts. Even if you don't agree, you might be able to glean what you need to know to play that game.
Exactly, because that's sort of the journalistic version of having a friend who knows your tastes.
Correct.
And can be like, hey, what should I play next? I just finished these things, having your game concierge, your game sommelier, or whatever that is.
And Geoff has been that for me for many years. And I played Death's Door, and the first thing I said is, Geoff, you need to play this game, because I knew.
And I haven't yet, and the more you describe it, the more I'm kicking myself.
But
I just started Hades, okay?
All right, that's good. Look, as long as you're finally playing it, it's fine.
I love it. I know I would.
But it's one of those things where, famously, we said on the podcast, I was curious about Shovel Knight. I'd never played it. Geoff went, here's the 3DS copy. Go try it. And I loved it. And then I immediately gave it back when I saw him next and then bought it on the Switch. I think that at the end of the day, these certain things will drive you to play games. And I don't think you should ever just blindly trust any of them. I think use them to guide you. But at the end of the day, if something has piqued your interest, but it's kind of outside the genre of gameplay or aesthetic or narrative that you would play, try it anyway. I think experimentation, especially within games now, is so key to discovering what you really like, because I still feel like sometimes I don't know what I like until I play it and go, I like this thing, And I think this kind of a conversation is more to get you thinking about, well, why do I play this game? What do I like about this game? Where can I find more games like this? And what does games like this even mean at this point? Because what are you comparing it to? What are the comparable traits that you're looking for?
Yeah, there are incredible articles out there. There's one that's called I Can't Believe It's Not Zelda that is a full list of, okay, which Zelda game do you like or want an experience like or as? And here are some games that follow that, and here are some reasons why. It's very funny, all of the bits and pieces and fiddly bits that connect us to the next game experience or is why it catches us. And it should change from game to game. We are all interesting and wonderful people, and thus we don't like just one thing. And sometimes where one genre really works for you, like with this game, maybe not as much the other one. I do enjoy strategy RPGs, and I'm getting more and more into them as I go on. I was just very lucky that Final Fantasy Tactics was the first one I played, and it became like oh my God, I love this. And so I try to I'm still finding, what is it about that game that I like about strategy RPGs and carrying it forward. I'm finally starting up some Fire Emblem. I'm revisiting Disgaea. I'm getting some more on that, and I'm excited to do it. But this is a question that we're going to put to all of you listeners. What are the games that the genre of gameplay and story surprised you and how they matched up? What are the experiences that you like to have? Are they narrative? Are they gameplay? Which way do they tend to skew? Where was a game that surprised you because by all accounts, you shouldn't have loved it, and yet you did? And do you know why? We want to know.
Yes, please tell us. We are always looking to expand conversations like this because it doesn't just end with this. And we'll probably revisit this conversation as things get more dynamic and we discover more games through this kind of lens and the lenses we use to observe them.
Oh, yeah.
There are many places you can reach out to us and engage in the conversation. We post every new episode in our Discord server where you can chat about each episode as they release. You can find a permanent invite link to our Discord server at certainpov.com, along with all of our fellow podcasts that we love dearly who are on the network with us. You can, of course, tweet at us at Fun and Games Pod on Twitter. We are at Fun and Games Pod on Facebook. We are at Fun and Games Pod at gmail.com for your email missives. If there is a genre you'd like us to talk about, a guest you'd like us to have, a certain kind of thing you would like us to discuss, please reach out. We are always looking for different ways to diversify the conversation on this podcast. Geoff and I do this because we're friends and we love games, but we always love to expand the conversation as much as we can to include everyone else out there. Also, if you have just a moment, if you go to the podcast platform of your choice, write us a rating and a review, or share this podcast with just one person you know who might like it, that hugely helps grow our audience and continue this conversation about video games that we'd love to have.
And if there's a game that you absolutely love and want to talk about, we do have a side series called Side Quests, where we have different hosts talking about video games they love. They're never more than 15 minutes, so if you just want to gush about something you love, and maybe this episode inspired you to think of a game that you love, reach out to us, and we'd love to have you on to talk about it. Please join our Discord and join us in being super excited about Metroid Dread. Whatever way you want to engage, we welcome you and encourage you to, because at the end of the day, this is a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.
Are you tired of watching your beloved characters being tortured by careless authors?
Are you sick of feeling like they could have swapped out all of the painful action and the plot would remain untouched? Subscribe to Books That Burn, the fortnightly book review podcast focusing on fictional depictions of trauma.
We assume that the characters' reactions are reasonable and focus on how badly or well they were served by their authors.
Join us for our minor character spotlights, main character discussions, and favorite non-traumatic things in the dark books we love.
Find us on Spotify, iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.